History rarely turns on a single day. But every so often, an event happens that shatters the geopolitical landscape so completely, the world before it feels like a distant memory. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're looking back at a profoundly somber and transformative moment in modern history, the February 2026 U.S.-Israel war on Iran. We're going to look closely at the data, the timelines, and the in-depth analyses from the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and Manara magazine to understand exactly how a targeted military campaign cascaded into a global crisis. Such wars always trigger political earthquakes with unpredictable and dangerous aftershocks. This insight from our sources perfectly sets the stage for our journey today. Because we aren't just looking at military tactics here. We're tracing the fault lines of a literal earthquake that shook global economies, fractured long-standing alliances, and completely rewrote the rules of engagement in the Middle East.
Chapter 1. The February 2026 Attack.
Okay, let's dive right into this timeline. On February 28, 2026, an immense U.S. armada, we're talking 2 entire aircraft carrier strike groups, joined forces with the Israeli Air Force for a massive military attack on Tehran. The primary objective was actually met almost immediately when the strike killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But as you'll see, this was really just the beginning. By mid-2026, the entire region was engulfed in retaliatory strikes, and by late 2026, one of the most vital waterways on the entire planet was completely choked off. But before we get into the macro-level geopolitics, we have to ground this history in its human cost. During that initial wave of attacks, the sources report that a school was tragically struck. Over 100 children were killed. It's a stark, devastating number, and it's a crucial reminder that beneath the grand strategies of nations, the heaviest price is always paid by civilians caught in the crossfire. Chapter 2. The Strategy of Horizontal Escalation. So how did Iran respond? They deployed a calculated, desperate survival strategy known as horizontal escalation. Rather than attempting to win a conventional military confrontation with the United States, which, let's be honest, was a fight they knew they couldn't win, Tehran broadened the battlefield. They essentially turned the geography of U.S. alliances into a combat zone. They placed American partners all across the region, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait, directly in harm's way, raising the cost of the conflict exponentially for everyone. And the retaliation was incredibly sweeping. Iran targeted not just U.S. military installations, but civilian infrastructure. We're talking airports, ports, hotels, and high-rise buildings. The psychological impact of this was just severe. For decades, cities like Dubai had meticulously marketed themselves as these oases of stability, right? Vital global hubs for business and tourism. And in a matter of days, that image was shattered, replaced by the terrifying reality of incoming missiles and drones flying over densely populated skylines. Chapter 3. The Global Economic Shockwave. And this brilliantly illustrates just how vulnerable the global system really is. 20%. That is the amount of the world's total oil supply that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. When hostility is forced to the effective closure of this narrow, strategic maritime corridor, the global energy market was sent into an absolute tailspin. Shipping flows were severely disrupted, oil prices skyrocketed, and the cost of war risk insurance, it surged literally overnight. But it wasn't just oil. In retaliation for an Israeli strike on Iran's massive South Pars gas field, Tehran launched missile attacks on regional energy infrastructure. The result of that? 17% of Qatar's liquefied natural gas export capacity was wiped out in a flash. And this was no quick fix. Sources estimate that this capacity was knocked offline for up to 5 years, completely upending global natural gas supply chains. To put the sheer financial devastation into perspective, it was staggering. According to the United Nations Development Program, Arab states incurred up to $194 billion in economic losses as a direct result of this conflict. And the dominoes just kept falling, reaching even further to hit the most fundamental human need of all, food. 1/3 of all global seaborne fertilizers are traded through the Strait of Hormuz. That disruption threatened to squeeze the global food system, raising the terrifying prospect of food emergencies and humanitarian crises, while simultaneously driving up domestic inflation and eating away at consumer purchasing power all over the world. Chapter 4. Unintended Consequences and Strained Alliances. This is where things got incredibly complicated behind the scenes. The transatlantic coalition really began to strain under the pressure. European nations hesitated to deploy warships to the region, terrified of sparking even more energy market instability. Shockingly, the U.S. was actually denied airspace access and the use of military facilities by several key allies. And adding to this immense friction, there was deep unease when the White House indicated it might ask Arab states to foot the bill for the war, a war that many of those exact same states had actively urged diplomacy against. Yet, amidst all this chaos, there were some profound, totally unexpected shifts in regional power dynamics. When Hezbollah cited the killing of Iran's supreme leader as a red line and launched missiles at Israel, Israel responded with devastating strikes on Lebanon. In a truly unprecedented move, the Lebanese government, clearly prioritizing its own national survival, formally banned Hezbollah's military activities. This was a massive assertion of state authority over a group that had long operated with unilateral military power, fundamentally altering Lebanon's political landscape.
Chapter 5: The Politics of War.
Now, let's look at the political motivations, because our sources present a pretty stark contrast here. On one side, you have the stated justifications from the political leaders involved. President Trump explicitly declared the aim was regime change in Tehran, while Prime Minister Netanyahu justified the war as a preemptive strike to stop a covert nuclear program he viewed as an existential threat. On the flip side, international law experts and our sources argue the war violated the UN Charter, noting there was no imminent threat to legally justify self-defense. Furthermore, they point out that the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency and international watchdogs had previously debunked claims of an active Iranian nuclear weapons program.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the uncertainty it reveals at the very top. When asked about achieving regime change before the attack, President Trump remarked, "Nobody knows. It would be nice if we could do it without military force." But as analysts point out, a massive country of over 90 million people doesn't simply collapse into a neat new democracy overnight. The lack of a clear post-regime governance plan created an extreme risk of a violent power vacuum, one far more likely to be felt by armed factions or military rule than by sudden stability.
Chapter 6: A Future of Managed Instability. So what did all this actually result in? Well, the sources conclude that what emerged wasn't a decisive victory, but rather an era of managed instability. It's a recurring system of coercive diplomacy. You have this cycle: intense military pressure from the US and Israel, which is then met with horizontal escalation and severe economic constraints imposed by Iran. Basically, escalation and negotiation function as interconnected tools. True stability isn't achieved through some grand resolution or peace treaty, but through constant painful adjustments by every single player involved. Which leaves us with this final lingering thought. As we look back at the historical turning point of 2026, we really have to ask ourselves, will this brutal cycle of coercive diplomacy ever actually lead to a sustainable peace? Or are we simply doomed to navigate endless, unpredictable aftershocks from a political earthquake that never truly settled? It's a haunting question, and one history is still trying to answer. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.